Good morning and welcome to the Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce's webinar on the legal framework for water and sanitation services in Brazil. First and foremost, we wish you and your families health and safety in this difficult time. Thank you all for joining us and thank Machado Meyer for sponsoring this timely event. Recently, the Brazilian Congress passed a new sanitation and sewage reform. Today, our panelists will discuss the impact of the new legal framework for water and sewage services, including possible removal of obstacles for privatization of state-owned water companies, such as SABESP, CEDAE, and others, options for full or partial privatization, incentives for private and foreign investment, incentives for more projects and investments, and the possibility of achieving universalization. Our moderator today is Virgilio Lopes Enei, a partner with Machado Meyer, and who co-heads the practice with José Prado. He is a leading lawyer in project finance, M&A, and PPPs in regulated sectors such as transport, oil and gas, power, sanitation, and urban and social infrastructure. Previously, he worked at Dewey Ballantine. Mr. Enei holds a Bachelor's of Law from the Universidade de São Paulo and a postgraduate degree in Business Administration from the Fundação Getúlio Vargas, a Master's of Law from the University of Virginia Law School, and a Master's in Commercial Law from the Universidade de São Paulo. You can find Virgilio's full bio and those of all the panelists on the link on the reminder that was sent yesterday and on the Brazilian American Chamber website. Before turning the screen over to Virgilio, I would ask you to please use the Q&A tab for questions. You can make them at any time, and we will look to answer them after the panel discussion during the Q&A period. Thank you. Without further ado, I will turn the screen over to Virgilio. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. I appreciate Brazilian American Chamber of Commerce for organizing this event. I appreciate everybody attending. We'll try to hold a very dynamic discussion here with my panel members and save some time at the end for questions from the audience. So please submit your questions through the chat here. And therefore, I will start the questions with Marta Seillier, who is the Special Secretary for the Partnership Program of the federal government. She heads the PPI initiative. And Marta, at the PPI, working alongside different ministries, BNDES, EPL, and others, you have an important role in coordinating project initiatives at the federal government, as well as supporting states and municipalities in their privatization or concession programs. Considering that most of the water and sewage sanitation, to say, projects are within the powers and attributions of municipalities, regions or the states, how exactly the PPI may contribute to these projects, to putting these projects together.
Good morning, Virgilio. I'd like to thank the Brazilian American Chamber for this invitation. Thank you, John, and all people that are here with us today. I brought a presentation. Let me see if I can do this to share some slides with you today. So I guess it should be opened on my computer so I can do it. The idea is to explain a bit of how PPI works and how we can benefit new PPPs and privatizations in the basic sanitation sector in Brazil, now that we have a new law that has been approved in Brazil, a bill that has recently passed. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay, so since PPI has been created, the Brazilian federal government investment partnership program. 178 projects have already been concluded with important auctions that guarantee to Brazil many investments in different sectors. So since the creation of the program, we can say that more than $160 billion will be invested in infrastructure in Brazil because of those auctions that already happened. And also important bonuses for federal government considering those auctions in Brazil. PPI is a council with the presence of important ministers in Brazil. The president himself participates in the meetings of PPI, where the ministers decide which projects will come to the portfolio, which projects will be a priority for investments and attracting private investors in Brazil. So this council meets at least 3 times a year, but we can also have extraordinary meetings, and that's when those decisions and discussions happen in Brazil. It happens, it works as a hub. PPI works as a big hub. It's an important tool for coordination inside Brazilian government. So since we have so many different areas with PPP projects and privatizations, we need to have a lot of coordination between all those ministries and agencies that have those projects in government. But we also have an important role dialoguing with the state level, the municipality levels, also with potential investors and investors that are already working in Brazil, financial agents, multilateral organizations, and we work a lot with the IDB, the World Bank, and other multilateral organizations. We dialogue a lot also with Congress, considering the important reforms and bills that are being voted and that we expect will open and help even more to attract investments in Brazil. So we can easily say it's a big hub for investment opportunities here in Brazil. So what about basic sanitation? Where are we and where are we moving to, considering the new bill that has just been approved? We have yet in Brazil this year more than 30 million Brazilians that still don't have access to clean and treated water. So that's a lot of people. But worse than that, when we consider the sewage collection, we still have 100 million Brazilians that don't even get the infrastructure for the sewage collection and consequently also for the sewage treatment in Brazil. So the World Health Organization estimates that 15,000 people die and 350,000 are hospitalized every year in Brazil because of diseases linked to the lack of basic sanitation. So it costs a lot to us in so many senses not to have invested all the infrastructure we need to universalize the services of basic sanitation in Brazil. We estimate that the universalization would reduce considerably the costs of the health costs in Brazil by 300 million, I'm sorry, I had it in billion, it's $300 million a year in Brazil. I'll change it. The fact that we lose also 38% of the treated water in Brazil makes it a loss of $2 billion a year. So a lot of inefficiencies also in the enterprises that are collecting and treating water in Brazil. We lose almost 40% of the water during this process, and it costs a lot, and consumers are paying for this lack of efficiency. We have many economic and social benefits by expanding the services in Brazil. So we can say that we could decrease considerably the costs with hospitalizations, with the leaves from work, We could increase productivity at work and also education if we had more investments in basic sanitation. Same thing for real estate valuation, and very important also, the impacts of this lack of sanitation in protection the Brazilian environment. So what is not working well can be even worse if you consider that this is a sector that depends a lot on public investments, and we have a fall in investments by state-owned sanitation companies due to this fiscal crisis in the states and also the union. So how can we make all the investments needed to provide the services if it is essentially provided by state-owned companies, so depending on public money, and we have fiscal crisis in Brazil. This is the main reason why we had to review the legislation of the sector and open its doors for private investments. So currently, we only have 6% of the share of this market in Brazil provided by private companies. It is interesting to see, though, that those 6% are investing 20% of all the share of investments in Brazil. So see how the private sector is more capable of investing than the public sector in this basic sanitation sector in Brazil. In fact, a private concessionaire in Brazil is investing today 2.5 times more than a state-owned company. The investments for the universalization of basic sanitation in Brazil are estimated around $120 billion. And that has a great potential also for creating jobs in Brazil in the next years. So to recover from coronavirus crisis in Brazil, we trust that private investments will be very important. Investments in infrastructure and basic sanitation will be an essential part of all this, with all the opportunities for universalizing the services. So before, we had a legislation with some issues that needed to be addressed, such as issues regarding the responsibility for the services. So in Brazil, the municipality is the one responsible, but at the end, 70% of the services in Brazil are being provided by state-owned companies at the state level. So the cities are giving their responsibility to the states without a bidding process or without competition, just sending it to a public company at the state level. And the federal level has the responsibility for giving guidelines and financing a lot of those projects with our public banks, with special rates for basic sanitation, let's say, but also giving money to some smaller cities for some communities investing in basic sanitation. We have a problem of lack of coordination of this national policy because we have so many players involved in the municipalities, at the state levels, at the union, and even at the federal level. We have different ministries and agencies dealing with basic sanitation, so that was a problem. A lack of regulatory surveillance, and that's an issue because in Brazil, as the service is a responsibility of the municipalities, we have municipality agencies, regulatory agencies acting in the sector, and today we have more than 50 different agencies regulating basic sanitation in Brazil. So it's literally a mess in terms of guidelines, coordination, and even expectation for the investor to know how things will happen if there are so many players regulating those investors. A lack of public funds, I mentioned, the level of investments with public money is going down, and we need to increase a lot the level of investments in basic sanitation. A timid forecast of the participation of the private sector before the change in the legislation, and the sanitation plans valuing a lot the local perspective and not so much the regional perspective, so making it harder to reach every Brazilian in this sector. So Brazil's what has changed? What this new legal framework will bring to this sector? What are the main changes? One important change is that the Brazilian National Water Agency now has the power to provide regulatory guidelines for the basic sanitation. So we'll have a federal agency regulating with best practices what should be a good regulation by the regional agency. So we'll have a head agency guiding the other agencies in this job to have a pattern of regulation and bringing more expectations to the investors of how this process of regulation will be. Besides, we expect to have an efficiency shock at state-owned companies in this sector with the fact that the municipalities won't just be able to sign contracts with state-owned companies anymore without going through a bidding process. So now we believe that competition will bring more private investors to this sector, and also will guarantee that only good public companies can have contracts if they participate in a bidding process, if they have the capability of doing the investments and providing the levels of services that those contracts will demand. So it enables the privatization of state-owned sanitation companies, and that's important because amazingly, before this law, it was prohibited to sell the control of state-owned sanitation companies. So the ones that we have that have private shares are always under the control of the company. The control has to keep public, and now with the new law, enterprises, important enterprises such as SABESP in the state of São Paulo will have the possibility of selling control of those companies. It makes it possible for the ownership of the services to be exercised by the states together with the municipalities. So when we talk about PPPs and structuring PPPs, we try to aggregate many cities in Brazil in blocks of concessions to have one contract at the state level and make the governance of the contract easier. And most people attended by the services with the PPPs, so trying to make it bigger, let's say largest. Establishing the reference blocks for the regionalized provision of public basic sanitation services, that's what I mentioned. It creates the Interministerial Basic Sanitation Committee to ensure the implementation of this coordination between the federal government deciding we'll still need public money in this sector, but let's make it more intelligent allocation, considering that we'll have so many PPPs structured and privatization. Let's bring public money to the areas where the PPPs will happen less or are more difficult to happen. And also the provision of basic sanitation services in consolidated informal settlements. So that's what we call the favelas here in Brazil, the problems we have with places poor people live, and as they are not formal areas, sometimes even for the public sector to provide services, it's hard. So now the legislation brings incentives to reach those people, even in informal areas, with basic sanitation services. So this new legal framework has important guidelines for structuring the concessions, and we are already working together with BNDES, our developing bank, and Caixa Econômica Federal, another important public bank, on the structuring of those PPPs, 30 years, 35 years PPPs in different states, and what are those guidelines of structuring. We are working on a clean state model. So concessionaires receive assets without liabilities. We want to make sure that investors will be interested in coming to this sector without getting to deal with liabilities of the public companies that were working there before. Streamline governance, so only one regulator for this contract. This is important, and make sure the regulation can be forecasted and understood by this investor. Regional tariff for those contracts, legal certainty, addressed and structured regulation, the appropriate risk allocation for each one of those contracts, levels of service, and that's very important. We're not so much worried about making sure each investment happens. The regulation will be looking at the levels of service that you have to provide the service to this part of the population with those characteristics and this level of quality. Solutions in large scale for city clusters, levels of investments compatible with the goal of universalizing those services, incentives for a more efficient system operation, flex engineer solutions, so the contract doesn't say exactly which engineer solution you have to use, just the level of service you have to bring to the population and the share of the population you have to reach during time with water and sewage collection and treatment, and feasible improvements in levels of services. So here I have an example of some of the projects that are being structured. As I mentioned, part of them by BNDES, the developing bank, and part of them PPI with the other public bank, the Caixa Econômica Federal. So see that the new law has just been approved, but we already have many important projects being structured, and some of them even for auctions this year, and many of them next year, 2021. So for solid waste projects, and that's important. When we talk about basic sanitation, it's water collecting, treatment, distribution, also sewage collection and treatment, but we also have inside basic sanitation concept the services regarding the collection of solid waste and transportation and correct destination of solid waste in Brazil. So we have already 4 projects happening in different areas. 2 of them are consortium of cities, so bigger projects with many cities working together, such as the consortium Convale in the state of Minas and the consortium Comares in the states of Ceará. It's the yellow pins inside Brazilian map, and some also PPPs that are being structured within the municipalities, such as Teresina in the state of Piauí and Bauru. So in these PPPs, the private investor has a responsibility for contracts of more than 30 years, where they have to collect all the solid waste, transport those solid waste to the right destinations. And we also consider some possibilities of using the energy of this waste in the project to make it more feasible. The concessionaire is paid by tariffs, and all this is only fitting in our feasibility studies with those tariffs being paid by the population within the bill of water and waste. So in the same bill, population can pay also for the services of solid waste in Brazil with those projects. We also have important projects in water distribution and sewage. In the next slide, I have some detail on the numbers for BNDES. So the next concession we'll have, and the bidding documents have already been published, will be in the state of Alagoas. We have the metropolitan region of Maceió, which is the capital of the state. The concession of water and sewage in the state of Alagoas will happen in September, 30 September, the auction. Bidding documents already published, and we expect to reach 1,400,000 people with those services, and many of the investments happen already in the first years of the concessions. A very important project also being structured right now is in Rio de Janeiro, in the state of Rio de Janeiro. Many cities involved. We are considering almost 14 million people in this contract, and investments that come up to $7.5 billion during those 30 years of contract in the state of Rio. A smaller project is happening in Espírito Santo. It's a PVP only for sewage that will happen also this year in 2020. And we are dialoguing a lot with other states together with BNDES to reach states such as Amapá. We already have the feasibility studies for the state of Amapá. It considers all the municipalities of the state, and we expect to launch the public hearing consultation in the next weeks. Same thing for the state of Acre. We already have feasibility studies done, and we are negotiating with the municipalities so that we make sure all the cities are included in this block and we have only one concession for the whole state. And other important projects that you can see in the slides, and those slides will be available for anything you need. So this is an example of how the project is structured. In Alagoas, we have the capex for water and even for sewage is happening a lot in the first 8 years of the concession. I would say the first 6 years, most of the investments will happen, and then it's more about maintaining and OPEX. So many jobs and many opportunities will happen in Brazil in the next 5 years because of so many projects in basic sanitation. If you consider that the state of Maceió is such an important state in Northeast Brazil, and we're talking about the metropolitan region that reaches almost 40% of all the population of the state, and you look at the current numbers of sewage collection and treatment, we're talking about less than 18% of the population of this metropolitan region has the sewage removal services today in the state, so less than 18%. And the project will guarantee that 90% of this population gets the service in maximum 16 years, but most of the investments, as you can see, will happen in the first 5-6 years. Also for water, even though we have more people receiving the water services, almost 70% of coverage, we have 43% of losses in those services. So see how inefficient it is and all the opportunities the investor will have to make all those services more efficient. And that's why we can guarantee we'll have so many investments happening and population not feeling this with the rise of the prices, because we are counting that the private sector will bring a lot of efficiency to the provision of those services and make all the investments without the need to enhance the prices the population pay for this. So some detailed information on the solid waste projects when we consider the two consortiums I mentioned and the two cities that will have auctions happening already between this year for Convale, Minas, and Piauí, and next year for the consortium in Ceará and the city of Bauru in São Paulo. CAPEX and OPEX together, those numbers are in Brazilian reais, will bring more than $600 million investments to this sector of public solid waste services in Brazil. And this is my last slide showing some of our next auctions in PPI, not only in this basic sanitation sector, but also in transportation. We have 2 highways that we expect to launch the bidding process this year. One is the 163 that goes from Mato Grosso to Pará, and the other is the 153,080 from Goiás to Tocantins. Very important highway concession with many investments to come. Also in railways, we have an important railway in the state of Bahia that is called FIOL that we expect also to have the auction this year. And some important renewals. Yesterday, our audit court has allowed us to move forward with those 2 renewals of railways from the Brazilian enterprise Vale, the Vitória Minas Railway and the railway Carajás. Will bring many investments in this sector in the next years in Brazil. We'll have the auction of transmission lines in December, oil and gas also at the end of the year. We are moving forward with Eletrobras privatization, our state-owned company, the largest energy state-owned company in Brazil. We need to approve a bill in Congress to move forward with the capitalization model. We expect to approve this bill in Congress this year. We have 11 port terminals that will also go for auction this year. We'll start with the 2 areas in the port of Santos. They are essentially cellulose areas, but very big areas with the opportunity of investments that we are estimating around R$500 million. And this auction will happen in August. We already have a date saved for this auction, but also important areas in the port of Paranaguá, South Brazil, and North Brazil, Northeast in Maceió, like Alagoas, Itaqui, Maranhão, and north in Santana in the state of Amapá. We'll move forward with mining rights auctions, opportunities in the state of Goiás with copper and Northeast Brazil with phosphate. We'll have our first fishery terminal PPP happening this year in the state of Cabedelo, Paraíba. Important PPPs also for parks, administration, and forests. And this is a very important agenda to help Brazil keep safe its forests and parks from fires and illegal activities. So we're counting a lot on those concessions and PPPs to make sure those investors will have many obligations and help the public responsibilities also for preserving those forests and parks. And as I mentioned, the concessions of water distribution and waste, and also some public lightning PPPs that will happen this year that are being structured by BNDES and by Caixa Econômica Federal. So with the help of Brazilian federal government, we'll start already the 14 August, some days from here, with the auction of Feira de Santana in the state of Bahia, Aracaju in the state of Sergipe, and Franco da Rocha in São Paulo. So this is a bit of our pipeline in the next weeks and months. We have many, many other opportunities to come in 2021, and I'll be here with you for any questions.
Marta, thank you very much for the very clear and quite comprehensive presentation that already answered many of the questions I had for you. It's clear that a lot is being done in the water and sanitation sector. Clearly, the pandemic has slowed down projects and initiatives, but they are there and they will be implemented in the short, medium term. Certainly, we have the remaining of this year and next year to catch up after the slowdown. And it's clear that there are dozens of billions of dollars to be invested in the next decades towards universalization. I now turn to Teresa Vernaglia. Teresa is the CEO of BRK. Teresa, you have had a lot of experience in other concession utilities before joining BRK. BRK is now the largest private player in the water and sewage business in Brazil, serving more than 100 municipalities and approximately 15 million people in Brazil. So I ask you, is there still room for BRK to expand? From the perspective of BRK, how does the new sanitation law, this one enacted in July 15, favors such expansion? And one question that we always come up here is, are you convinced that the private companies can indeed provide a more efficient service and have better means to achieve universalization as compared to the state-owned companies? Will the private entities be able to take over small municipalities as well under the new sanitation legal framework? Thank you, Teresa.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Now we can,
yes,
yeah.
Now we can.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Teresa was not able to join today. She had a personal matter to at the last minute when she was joining. So I'm here to help you with these questions. So good morning, Marta, Dolly, José Virgilio, John, and Rafael. Glad to be able to join this conversation today. With respect to, you have three questions there, Zé. The first one relates to the regulatory framework. The second one relates to efficiency of the services, and the third one relates to small municipalities, if I got that correctly, right?
That's right. And by the way, let me introduce Daniela Sandoval. She's an executive officer of BRK. She handles and leads the legal department, human resources, and some other areas. Thank you for joining, Daniela.
You're welcome. So as José just mentioned, the Vice President of Regulatory Affairs and Regulations of BRK Ambiental. I work directly with Teresa and have participated intensively in the discussions relating the new regulatory framework, such as in the same way that Marta had been participating as well. So starting with the regulatory framework, it's been a discussion of over 2 years. We had to mature lots of matters that were being under discussion. The purpose of the regulations continued from the day one to what was enacted, which is placing incentives to underpin universalization of the services in Brazil. You are aware of the services being way below what's expected. So a new regulatory framework was needed so that the rules regarding new investments would be clear, or at least clear, and then investments could be fostered. So what we saw that was enacted, and of course we need to bear in mind that regulations are always subject to changes and some sort of improvement. But what we saw being enacted was, I would say, a very good piece of legislation because it touches many of the issues that we need to deal with in Brazil in order to evolve with the universalization of the services. To give you one example, having more standard rules is quite important. BRK has around 15 million clients around Brazil and has operations in 12 states. And we interact constantly with 20 agencies. That doesn't help a lot because, of course, with 20 agencies, you have very different views on several topics that we usually discuss with them. So from a investor's perspective, from a business perspective, having one single agency discussing the standard rules to be followed by the other agencies, having a unified discussion, and therefore expected to have a higher technical standard is very desirable from our perspective. So this is something that I think it's quite positive of the legislation that was recently enacted. Also a clear drive towards universalization because it sets a date for universalization in Brazil, 2033. It's 3 years after our commitments with the United Nations, which is the ODSs talk about 2030, but that's good enough because now we have a clear, let's say, deadline for the universalization of the services, and that's what we needed to actually move towards universalization. And linked to that, I would like to highlight also the financial capacity that needs to be evidenced. So not only you have a deadline for universalization and agreements that do not have goals underpinning that path would have to be amended, but also you need to demonstrate financial capacity. The financial capacity necessary to in fact, meet those goals until 2033. I would like to highlight one other matter, one other drive that I think is quite important. It wasn't in the first provisional measures, but it entered afterwards, which is the drive towards scale. So the regulatory framework talks about regions, blocks of cities being joined together for a project to be launched. And we believe that's quite positive because, in answering to the second question, Virgilio, when you spoke about small cities, small municipalities, we always thought, and I know that Marta also shares that thought, that every city could be universalized. It always depended on the type of project and the scale needed to make that feasible. Okay, so one of the important drives of this regulatory framework is the fact that it intends to form regions, blocks of municipalities in order to have scale for the services. And the last one relates to the so-called contratos de programa, the agreements between municipalities and state-owned companies, that because those are two entities of the state, public entities, they do not require a bidding. And once these agreements are not being done anymore, not formalized anymore, not renewed anymore, a whole market opens up for investors. So that's, in our view, also a very positive provision in the regulatory framework. And that's linked also to the fact that once changes were done to the rules relating to privatization, enabling the agreements to continue throughout the process of privatization, as opposed to what we had before, that the agreements would terminate upon privatization, which in practice made privatization impossible. That's also very positive in our opinion, because that enables privatization to occur. So I think I spoke about 4 or 5 topics or drivers that I think are very important, and in our opinion would in fact enable small municipalities to be joined together in a bigger project, and scale would allow them to be universalized as well. And when the last question relating to the efficiency of services, José Virgilio, I think we have efficient private companies and we have efficient public companies as well. Of course, it all depends on the incentives you have, but it would be unfair to say that we do not have efficiency in public-owned companies as well, state companies as well. So also important to have, in a good thing to have ANA as the regulatory agency driving these standard rules, because efficiency is also a matter of regulation and how you place the right incentives for private and state-owned companies to become more and more efficient and capture that efficiency to the benefit of the tariff, as well as to the benefit of the company itself. So sharing those efficiencies is a matter that needs to be discussed. In our experience, we had agencies that had different views on sharing of efficiencies. We had situations that all the efficiencies that we had created in an agreement, in the view of the agency, would have to be placed towards the tariff, which doesn't make sense from a logical perspective, because then you are not left as a company with incentives towards efficiency. So all of these discussions, I think, would be better placed from now on with Ana, and we're looking forward to the discussions on efficiency with Ana as well, and how to make incentives in the agreements. So I guess I answered all the questions, and happy to see if you have any other questions.
We'll certainly have, Daniela. Thank you very much. I see how the new law will contribute to bring more efficiency. You mentioned that you were dealing with 20 different sets of regulations within 12 states, and with a federal guideline. I see how your job is gonna be made easier, and that will translate in more efficiency to the services. And I also liked your response that in general, you could not say that private companies or state-owned companies would be more or less efficient one to another. It's a matter of competition, right? The market, the competition will show who can provide the best service under certain conditions. And in one way or the other, the consumers, the public at large will be the one deriving the benefits of such increased efficiency. So I now turn to my colleague, Rafael Vanzella. He's also a partner at Machado Meyer, very much dedicated to the water and sewage sectors. Rafael, I think we had a very good perspective from Marta in the public sector, from Daniela representing the private sector. I'm glad that the views and perspectives of both of them converged into recognizing the benefits of this new legislation. Marta provided a very impressive pipeline of different opportunities, but bear in mind that we have in the audience potential foreign investors, law firms, banks that will assist those foreign investors. I believe it would be helpful to distinguish the different kinds of opportunities that we have ahead in terms of privatization, greenfield concessions, a combination of these projects. For instance, there is a configuration in some of the most important ongoing projects according to which the state-owned companies would be preserved, but focus on providing wholesale water supply to the concessionaires, who would then serve the public, the consumers themselves. Can you provide more details on that? In which case do you believe one structure would be preferable to another? And so what kind of investors you think we might have in these different sorts of opportunities? Thank you, Rafael.
Thank you, Virgilio. Hi, Daniela, Marta, Dolly, John, and the other participants to this event. I think your question, Virgilio, is basically related to how private participation in water and sanitation may occur in Brazil. And I think we have, going to the basic, two different frameworks. On the one hand, there are the stockholding purchase structures, and on the other hand, the concessions. And concessions here understood as a general standard of a public-private arrangement in the sector. As for stockholding purchase, we must distinguish between privately held companies and state-owned companies. For privately held companies, any sort of a typical M&A transaction is applicable. Brazil has currently 4 or 5 big holdings of concessions and other operational units on water and sanitation. One is here represented very well by Daniela. And considering this environment, the transaction may refer to a single asset, to a number of assets, or even the acquisition of primary or secondary shares on the holding itself. We must recognize, however, that M&A in water and sanitation does not take place very often, although we have verified a consistently increasing amount of transactions in the last few years. And we do have grounds to believe that the interest for M&A in water and sanitation will also increase henceforth, considering the new law. For its turn, stock holding purchase of state-owned companies recommends a very different approach. Despite from a purely agreement structuring perspective, the purchase of state-owned companies may be very similar to a typical M&A transaction. Such companies are qualified as governmental entities, and thus, as a matter of principle, transactions on their shares require not only public auctions, but also a specific law authorizing government to sell its stake on such companies. I may go further on this later on, but I want to state now a few words about concessions. Concessions of water and sanitation utilities typically involve one single municipality as the granting authority and a private company as a winning bidder. Marta has showed us a lot of projects in this sense, mentioning a lot of municipalities that are now on ongoing process for their concessions. So water and sanitation utilities in Brazil lay under the authority of local governments. But this is a problem, as Marta explained, because Brazil has more than 5,000 municipalities. So in terms of transaction costs, it represents a problem for private companies if they deal with all these municipalities under a retail logic. This is why the new law fosters regional concessions, which are concessions of a cluster of municipalities. Regional concessions may refer to a whole metropolitan area, as happens with CEDAE in Rio de Janeiro, or with Casal in Maceió. Moreover, such concessions have adopted an unbundled structure. Under such unbundled structure, the state-owned companies such as SEDAI, Casal, remains managing the upstream services. So in other words, it remains responsible for producing, treating, and supplying water to the private concessionaire for a wholesale price, as you mentioned, and the private concessionaire is responsible for distributing water to final consumers, undertaking also the sewage services and the investment obligations to achieve the universalization goals. As we may see, such projects were structured under the old and now revoked legal framework, which means that the former law already allowed such schemes of concessions. What the new law does in this respect is the bureaucratizing the requirements for structuring these projects, auctioning them, and contracting them. It includes the unbundled model, as I mentioned before. And all this new regulatory environment makes us believe that we are about to see more and more of such projects in a short-term pipeline. Talking a little bit about the investors' profile we are about to see, or we are already seeing, I I think we that are very driven by assisting clients in doing infrastructure business in Brazil, we are watching to a quite interesting movement in this sector. In the past, we were used to see a lot of entrance barriers in many infrastructure sectors because the bid notices were used to set forth a very difficult, so a lot of requirements, very difficult to achieve by bidders in general. We are now living a very different moment, I understand. So the projects in general are open to any sort of investors. This is why we see many purely financial investors bidding for concessions and other PPP arrangements. And somehow, I would say that these projects are not only for strategic, operational or construction companies anymore. Although, of course, such companies have a natural competitive advantage on bidding for them, because they have previous experience and may know better how markets work. Set side by side with other sectors, water and sanitation offers, if we take into account the bid notice already launched, an even more attractive risk matrix by which government undertakes higher levels of risks and responsibilities in comparison to what we are used to see in other sectors, such as for environmental, demand, construction, technological, and KPIs risks. I think this may address your question, Virgilio.
Thank you very much, Rafael. Quite interesting. We'll come back with further questions later, but I will now turn to Dolly Mirchandani. Dolly is a partner at the global law firm of White & Case. She has long, strong experience in concessions, PPPs, from the perspective of private investors and lenders as well. Dolly, and please feel free, we count on you to bring the perspective, the international perspective here that you know better than anyone. So feel free to comment on any of the previous topics, but in particular, I would want you to share with us some distinctions between the Brazilian system, the Brazilian water and sewage sector and how it works as compared to the reality you see in the United States. We are now finally moving to a model that is more based on regions, on creating clusters of municipalities to bring scale that is emphasized by Daniela from BRK. Is so important to make these projects more efficient and more economically viable. So I would ask you to bring some colors to that distinction. In the United States, do you have the same kind of questions? Is that something that has already been overcome in the US? What lessons perhaps the more mature market of the United States could offer or not to our reality? That's one question. And then I would add to that, from your perspective, what kind of foreign investors do you think would be interested in those opportunities in Brazil? Should we expect a lot of interest from foreign investors and strategic financial pension funds and so on in those alternative opportunities that were presented by Marta and were better legally described by Rafael in terms of privatization, concessions, M&A activities, and as well. And finally, from the perspective of lenders, international lenders, here obviously these projects count on local financing as well, but we saw that we should have, Marta mentioned $12 billion in investments in the next years, and that's only a part of, those are only the projects that she presented on the top of many others that could be developed without the participation of PPI itself. So I believe we also need international financing to supplement local financing sources. So what are the issues that we should address, deal for those international financing? Thank you, Dolly.
Thank you, Virgilio. Thank you for inviting me to join in this conversation. Can you hear me okay? Because I'm hearing a lot of feedback.
Yes, we can hear you very well.
All right, wonderful. Well, as I say, it's a tremendous privilege to join this conversation with yourselves at Machado Meyer, who we enjoy a long relationship with, but also with Marta and Daniela, who have spent so much time to consider this market opportunity in Brazil. The water sector is a sector of personal interest to me. We have a very global water practice, and so it's a pleasure to bring that perspective to bear on this discussion. And there may be some surprising similarities and differences that I can comment on. The one thing we all have in common, no matter which country we are in, is the supply of water and the treatment of wastewater is a common issue around the world, right? I mean, it's a fundamental, and I think the word basic is there for a reason in the law. Basic sanitation is a fundamental service that we all need. And the implementation of it has been deployed, using lots of different structures in different places. But let me focus on the US, as you asked me to, and I'll tackle the first of your questions. In some respects, the US shares some very strong similarities with Brazil. Layers of government regulating the water industry, so at the federal level, the state level, and the local level. But the role of the federal government until now has really been limited to the regulation of water quality. So the key federal, shall we say, interaction with the states and the localities has been really through environmental regulation under the Environmental Protection Agency, a focus on water quality and standards. So it's really I would say an environmental regulator rather more than an economic regulator in the US. Now, with respect to the comments that have been made about Brazil's challenges with having 5,000 disaggregated systems, shall we say, servicing the population. If you think this is a challenge, then you will appreciate that in the US, this challenge is magnified because, in fact, in the US, and some people find this hard to believe who are not focused on this industry, there are in fact more than 53,000 water districts. So it's actually a much more severe issue of disaggregation in the US than in Brazil. Now, interestingly, when you look at the nature of who provides water services in the US, only 11% of the population is served by what I would call private investor-owned utilities. And these are private companies who are regulated from an economic perspective because of the monopolistic nature of their services by a state level, what are called public utility corporations and commissions. And the way that they are regulated is that there is regulation of rates that can be charged to users, and there's regulation also of expenditures, whether CapEx or OpEx. Because there has to be some mechanism to ensure ratepayers who are paying the water rates that the investments that are being made and the dollars upon which a reasonable rate of return, which is the test for equity return in this private investor-owned utility space, that the CapEx in fact is optimized CapEx. Because when you have a structure where every dollar that is spent on CapEx generates an equity return, you have a perverse incentive to spend money, and you have to make sure that the money that is being spent is in fact needed. So the review of the capital expenditure into the system is made by the regulator to ensure that CapEx is reasonable and that the return being earned on the CapEx is also reasonable. Now that is a statutory regulatory framework. It's not a contract. So what we see is that the rest of the population, the vast majority of the population, is served by publicly owned and managed municipalities or other similar regional water systems. And it's very fragmented, like I said. So the challenges in the US are actually the identical, if not frankly more challenging than the existing situation before this law was enacted in Brazil. Now, the result of this structure is that while the quality of water is regulated, the economic, should we say, management of the water systems by the municipalities, as you can imagine, becomes a matter of local politics. They will invest money if it serves the short-term political cycle as opposed to the long-term optimization of the management of the system. And honestly, this is happening all over the country. So what we see now, and it's been well documented, is a massive amount of deferred investment. People who have not invested in maintenance, right? The municipalities who have not invested in maintenance adequately, decaying and aging systems, and real political pressure not to raise the water rates. Now, interestingly also, the water rates are the smallest part of an American family's utility bill. If you look at the price of electricity and other basic amenities, the water bills are the smallest portion of what a family will pay. But even then, I think there is this philosophy of water being a universal right in some respects. One shouldn't have to pay a huge amount for it. As a result, a lot of political pressure to keep rates low, which means very little funding for the necessary capital investment. So you actually have a ticking time bomb, actually, in my view, with a lot of the US systems. And I think confronting similar challenges to the ones that have been faced in Brazil. Now, at the same time, there is a need, I think, to connect the dots between this massive amount of investment need and the massive amount of equity and debt available in the infrastructure investment community to invest in these projects. And what you need is sort of an ingredient, a catalyst, right? Because when you have a disaggregated system, you have all of the problems that Daniela spoke about. You know, multiple layers of regulatory interaction, a lack of standardization, a lack of scale, because people who want to invest hundreds of millions of dollars or billions even, you know, if they go around the country looking at 53,000 systems, it's going to take an awful long time and an awful lot of resource to get those individual transactions consummated. So I think in truth, when it comes to the regulatory framework, Brazil now with the successful implementation of this federal law actually has a lot to teach the US rather than vice versa from what I'm seeing. Because actually what I think is very impressive, and I congratulate Marta and the government for enacting such a law, is all of the benefits that Daniela spoke to, a standardized framework, right? Consistent rules to promote and make efficient the investment of those dollars. The implementation of best practices. I'm very impressed that the law has included a condition in it, and I think this is really important, that as a condition to obtaining funds and technical support from the federal government, the regions and the municipalities will need to participate in the structure. That will provide a huge incentive to bring everybody to the table and, you know, derive the benefits, right, that the federal government wishes to see from the enactment of this law. So I think the incentivized bundling is an absolutely phenomenal initiative. Truly, I do think it's going to lead to optimization and more bang for buck. Now, let me turn though to an area where I think America might be able to help. It's one thing to enact the law. It's another thing to optimize the concessions and the contracts under which these projects will be implemented. And Rafael touched on that a little while ago as well. Interestingly, not many transactions have been done in the US. I've been very lucky to have been involved in most of the ones that have been done on a concession basis. involving investors similar to Daniela, who have come to invest in municipalities. Now, those transactions were not done on an aggregated basis. The scale has been relatively small, order of like, say, $200–300 million, as opposed to the billions that you see in the slides from Martha, and frankly need to be invested in America also. But what those transactions do is provide an interesting, I think, reference point for some best practices on the contract side and the risk allocation side, to provide a stable framework for the implementation under the bundled or the aggregation, should we say, structure, so that the contracts that are eventually implemented are done in a stable way and implemented in a way to actually now you have the framework, you have the scale, you have everybody at the table with a terrific investment opportunity in front of them. Now it's important to get the contracts in a place where they can, in fact, generate the optimization. Now, let's look at the foreign investor question that you asked, which was, how will they come? Will they be attracted? This is obviously the goal of one of the goals of the legislation that's been enacted. Look, Brazil is such a huge market. This is such a huge step forward. I personally think that this law will generate a very significant amount of interest from large pools of capital that are dedicated to infrastructure development, whether pension funds or large-scale infrastructure funds, many of whom are clients of ours. Now, in terms of creating a stable investment structure and an appropriate framework, what the US water concessions have done is that they have mimicked the structure of the regulatory framework in the US and put those structures into the contract. And what that effectively does, and I'm just going to focus on CapEx because that's a big problem, right? The actual money that is required to bring these systems up to 21st century standards and optimizing the construction, but also the operational benefits of the delivery of the services over a long term, which, as Martha said, is, we're counting on to pay for all of this, right? Without raising rates too much. So in order to enable that, you really have to look at the CapEx very carefully. The way that it's been structured in the US under the contracts is to say that the CapEx program, the initial CapEx program is defined. However, because of the challenge of due diligencing these systems, these are mainly subterranean systems where it is very hard to perform the necessary due diligence to identify the full CapEx program up front. What that means is that by necessity, any CapEx program is going to be a guesstimate. However, once you actually implement the plan and you start to discover the sheer scale of the need, and you're able to then price up and establish the CapEx program with more specificity, it goes through an approval process and a budget panel type of approval process in order to ensure that the price of that CapEx and the necessity of the CapEx is well determined. At that point, there is an adjustment, if appropriate, to the rates, or maybe a payment, a compensation payment from the government, depending on whether you want to use the rate mechanism or a government compensation mechanism to implement the CapEx. Now, why do I mention this? I mention this, A, because that's the way that it's been structured in the US, which may be an interesting comparison, but also because in the concession, for example, in Rio, that's been put out for public comment, in looking at this, we see that the bidders are not compensated for the CapEx through the tariff, but rather the tariff is set at the outset of the concession with OPEX adjustments only. That then could lead to a higher operational cost profile. It's incentivizing higher operational costs and lower CapEx, where sometimes it's actually smarter to increase your CapEx in order to generate lower OPEX over time. You have to optimize, right, the combination of those two. So I think that on the one hand, there is, according to Martha and the presentation, a clean slate structure with respect to liabilities. But I think there also needs to be some consideration as to the viability of identifying necessary CapEx up front, and whether in a system as complicated, I'm using the real one just as an example, as that, is it realistic to try to establish that up front? So there could be a very significant challenge to due diligence underground assets of that magnitude, and the tariff mechanism, may not be fully responsive to that. I think investors are likely to focus on something like that. Define technical standards is very important. Understanding the rules of the game in the beginning, and also how that might change. But when you're looking at concession terms for 35 years, again, it's stability of expectation. If the standards are going to change, what mechanism might be used to manage those changes, and then any costs coming from those changes. And that's something that needs to be thought about and calibrated. Let me put it slightly differently. In implementing privatization, I think it's very important that we don't privatize problems. Because if you privatize problems and you don't solve problems in the process, then you can also generate instability in a long-term contractual framework. Investors and I think debt providers all focus very much on compensation on termination provisions in international concessions, like the one that is being proposed. I would recommend that that is an area, certainly in the examples that have been published so far, that will get a lot of scrutiny from equity and debt investors. And my personal recommendation would be to take a look at the standards that have been used in international concessions in order to structure those in a way that protect the investors and the debt providers where necessary, but equally do not protect them in cases where there is true default by the concessionaire. Dispute resolution, another key area for international investors. Again, using the Rio concession as an example, arbitration has been selected, which I think is a positive approach. And then, care needs to be taken to select an arbitral tribunal and the applicable rules that will foster confidence from international investors. A set of rules that are internationally recognized that people can rely on, I think would go a long way. Now, lastly, just looking at some lender issues, and I think it would be remiss not to mention the issue of currency. So if we start there, the tariffs are denominated in local currency. It's a huge number. The 14 billion or so number that in Marta's slides. I think there's a real question about market capacity, whether or not there's adequate local currency debt capacity, whether locally or from the international financial institutions, to get all of that done. Now, international financial institutions like IFC or IDB, they do lend in reais, and I think that they are well accustomed to doing so. I think those institutions are innovating with new structures such as B-bonds to generate liquidity from the capital markets and provide a vehicle for increased amounts of rights-based lending. But if market capacity is constrained, and this can affect pricing, and so you again want to optimize your financing just as you want to optimize the technical delivery of the water project, I think it would be important to consider currency risk mitigation strategies in order to eliminate or reduce those risks to enable foreign currency lenders to support the projects. And those mitigations can take different forms. For example, I've seen in some concessions that have been denominated in local currency, you can implement some kind of cap collar concept where if there are currency fluctuations outside of a particular band, there are top-up payments that are made to enable debt service that is dollarized to be met. You would need to analyze availability of currency swaps in the market. Long-term currency swaps are typically either challenging to get or expensive. And so again, on the structuring side, I think important to consider the cost-benefit analysis there. And if you need to attract the foreign based currency lenders, then we need to figure out a solution that manages the risk and what is the most optimal solution, the most cost-effective solution all around. Now, on some more sort of slightly technical issues, I'll just mention a couple more. One is, again, looking at the Rio contract as an example, I think it's going to be important to get the plumbing right in some of these contractual areas and to provide, what I think international lenders will look to as a customary package of lender rights, notices of default directly from the government to the lenders, the ability to step in and cure concessionaire defaults should be clarified. Another important aspect, lenders will typically require the assignment by way of security of the concession to them, and that I think is provided for and understood, but then lenders will want to be able to enforce that security without that enforcement right being subject to state consent, because that would be difficult for them to rely on if it's only there with the consent of the government. So these are to give you, some flavors, if you will, having looked at the Brazilian law, which I think, as I say, is a tremendous advancement and something to be learned from in the US, but maybe sharing with you some ideas based on the US concession experience of areas where in launching the program, areas to consider in optimizing the contractual structure, because the more the template documents become balanced in their risk allocation, ultimately, I think the more stable the contracts and the better value that can be delivered by Daniela and her colleagues in the equity investment space, as well as the debt providers that they will bring with them.
Dolly, thank you very much for the raw comments. Very much appreciated. And it's good we have Marta here. I know that one of the important roles of the PPI is to listen to the market and receive comments, have the opportunity to review those comments in the permanent job of improving the contracts, the structures, the models, right? So we are almost at the time to turn into the questions of the audience. But before that, I will take this opportunity to turn to Daniela and to Rafael. I would like to ask them to comment on the risk issues that were raised by Dolly. Obviously, the water and sewage sector has its own particularities in terms of risk profile. When you think of the more mature market of toll roads in Brazil, for instance, the demand risk is one of the most important ones. When you think about power generation, the construction risk itself, it's very relevant. Afterwards, you may have long-term PPAs in a much more stable, predictable scenario. So I would like to ask Daniela and Rafael, starting with Daniela, taking the opportunity to having listened to the comments of Dolly from the international perspective, to share with us what would be the most important risks in this water and sewage concessions in Brazil. What are the risks that already well mitigated or that have been mitigated by the new law, as it was already mentioned here? And what else, taking advantage of the presence of Marta and the PPI here, eager to hear good comments and suggestions, what do you think could be made better in terms of the structures and contracts in order to mitigate those risks and make those projects even more viable or attractive to private investors? Daniela, can you start commenting on that?
Sure. So I think that what Dolly brought is our, let's say, main challenge now, risk allocation. So we were able as a country to put up a set of rules that places incentive on private investment, and in fact, in all sorts of investments, incentives to have regions, which is also very good, incentives for new contracts and standard rules. But I think that the challenge we have ahead is risk allocation. We've seen projects being launched that have all of the sorts of risks that you just mentioned. So when you model an investment and you're considering to bid on a new project, and you have a subterranean investment done already that you have to count for in order to do your model. You naturally don't have the possibility to due diligence it very well because it's under the land. But that should be taken into consideration. And what we've been seeing is that the risk allocation is placed on the concessionaire without really knowing what's being transferred. So therefore, the maintenance or even replacement capex necessary for that is somewhat a guess, an estimate, but this uncertainty should be decreased to the as much as possible, to the extent possible. So that's one thing that I would like to highlight. Also, as Virgilio said, the demand risk allocation is something that we've been discussing. All of the projects right now place demand risk towards the concessionaire. And you have, we can discuss demand risk many times here, but when you think about a long-term investment such as sanitation, 30, 35 years of investment, and who could better manage the risk of demand in a city, either the granting power or the concessionaire. I think it's hard to say that you could avoid all sorts of events in 30, 35 years that would prevent what we saw in roads. I am especially concerned about this demand risk allocation, the way it is, just shifting totally the demand risk to the concessionaire, not within bands or any sort of a percentage of risk, but just shifting it, because we know what a political correct drive or wrong drive can do to a city, and drive demand or towards increasing or decreasing. So I think that demand risk is not being correctly dealt with in some of the projects yet. I think in that sense, we have not evolved because there were projects from the past that had the demand risk allocation placed in a better way with bands of allocation and sharing of risks and not just placing towards the concessionaire. Licensing as well is something that we think shouldn't be placed the way it is, just straightforward towards the concessionaire, because licensing in Brazil, although I'm aware of initiatives of the federal government to make it less bureaucratic and fast track the licensing process. What we have right now, what we live right now as concessionaires is there are places that we simply don't get the license to do the project, and we do need, and sometimes we have the public prosecutors also joining the discussion and saying that the license is necessary, but then sometimes you just don't get the license for one reason or another, or it's delayed, sometimes even for political reasons. The last risk that I would like to highlight that I'm seeing in these new projects is the water production. So the supply of water coming from a state-owned company, or as a matter of fact, any company, and the sharing of infrastructure. We are seeing some projects that have the sharing of infrastructure, and this also is a risk that we believe has to be better discussed. Last but not least, when you mention about the political cycle, a short political cycle as opposed to a long-term agreement and long-term investment, this is exactly what we live every day. And in my opinion, we need to be able to build stronger agreements with better placed risks, so that over time we don't need to interact as much, and we don't need to make as many amendments and discussions with either granting powers or agencies. So if the agreement is strong enough to support the services throughout 30, 35 years, that's exactly the goal we should look forward to. And the reason is quite simple. Whenever you have points of interactions, people may bring political issues into the discussion. So then the service is not the the main, is not at the spotlight anymore. It's not the most important matter on the table anymore, but rather the political scenario comes as stronger. So I would say that decreasing the interactions also, so that the political scenario doesn't interfere as much into the services and the technical discussions, is something also that a strong set of rules in the contracts and right risk allocation would also help. So those are my comments on risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Daniela. Very good points indeed. I turn then to Rafael. Rafael, do you agree with all these points? Would you add any other aspects to this risk discussion?
Sure, thank you, Virgilio. I think Daniela has made a very comprehensive presentation of all the risks. I would comment here, but if I could add something, or few words on what she just said, and taking the advantage that Marta, as a government representative, is here. I would say that risk allocation, we have, so besides those problems that Daniela laid down here, so CapEx risk, governance between the state-owned company in charge of producing and supplying water for a wholesale price, and its interaction with the private concessionaire in charge of all other services of the concession, environmental license, demand risk, and so on. We have sometimes in the concrete risk matrix in the bid notices already launched or published by state governments, sometimes a problem of in the logics of risk allocation, because when we structure a risk matrix, we should have as per assumption that we should firstly identify the contracting party more able to undertake a certain risk, right? And what we have been seeing in these bid notices already published is that sometimes this assumption or this principle is not being followed. I'll give you an example. There are some projects, for example, that the demand risk is fully allocated to the private concessionaire, but all the commercial managing of the project and even the enforceability of the tariffs are still on the responsibility of the granting authority. So it doesn't make sense, because so one can undertake the demand risk if logically it's still able to enforce, to collect the tariffs, and to have a direct relationship, commercial relationship with the consumers, right? And this unlogic principle brings even more complexibility to some risks allocation in some projects we have been following nowadays. Besides that, I would only put on the top of what Daniela contributed here, that a word about legal certainty. Brazil as an emerging market, we are very used to hear or to have questions on this matter. How much these bid notices or even the new regulatory framework contributes to legal certainty. I think we have a very different problem of legal certainty in Brazil in comparison to other emerging markets. Legal certainty in Brazil has few to do with political risks. So we have a very strong track record in what concerns to respect with agreements already entered into. What happens really in Brazil sometimes is that the political cycle, so a different mayor or a different governor at the local or the state level, when it decides to change to change some tariff politic or some contractual condition, such mayor or such governor may start a dispute on it. And I think Brazil has been improving the methods to deal with this sort of risk, because we have more and more often now arbitration in the agreements, and bringing a professional to deal, to discuss, and to arbitrate such disputes, of course, brings a lot of more legal certainty in this respect. And I think we have faced a lot of obstacles in the past to have this arbitration in our agreements, but now we have, and now we can also have international chambers such as ICC and others being chosen to solve, to compose all these conflicts of interests, and I think it was a very important gain for all the concession agreements, and this is now a reality in water and sanitation as well. I think it's everything I have to contribute by now, Virgilio.
Thank you, Rafael. So I think now we can open to questions from the audience. I would start with Gabriela Valente. Gabriela Valente is our friend at our media partner, Information. She has helped us with the event, and she will make the first comment. Please, Gabriela, feel free to address your question to any of the panel members.
Thank you all for this opportunity. As Virgilio said, I work with Information. We provide a global business intelligence service. So we map transactions and investments opportunities in infrastructure and power sectors across the globe. And I'll be delighted to discuss the Brazilian market with all the panelists and people from the audience afterwards. And what I'd like to ask you is a little more details on the expectations regarding to international investments, because we hear a lot of optimism from local companies like BRK, but there's also some criticism in the political field regarding to the raise of water tariffs and etc. So I'd like to know if there are ongoing talks with international investors, what type of investments or of investors they are, if they are funds, operational players, and what is the level of attraction that you are observing so far for the Brazilian projects?
Would you like to address to any specific panel member?
I think Marta.
Marta, okay. Marta, I know that you have a slide on PPI showing all the foreign investors that have already been attracted to the project pipeline put together by PPI, and that is quite impressive. We have investors from all over the world, but perhaps you can comment on the interest that you might have already received specifically to the water and sanitation project, which kind of foreign investors from which countries or which profile have already approached you at the PPI.
Perfect. Thank you, Gabriela. Thank you, Virgilio, for your question. So yes, we have been talking to many potential investors. So investors that are already operating services here in Brazil, such as the Brazilian companies that already have contracts in basic sanitation, but also investors that operate similar contracts in Europe. We have the French that have already asked for meetings with us from Veolia and other enterprises. Besides the operational investors, let's say those that already invest this type of infrastructure, we have been talking to many funds, so financial investors, pension fund investors. We've talked to funds in Canada that look pretty much to this ESG agenda, opportunities of investments that are also looking at environment, at social opportunities. And basic sanitation is very much ESG in the sense that we are taking care of lives of children. It's a health issue in Brazil, but it's also a very important issue regarding the nature and all the waste that is being sent to our oceans, to our rivers, and bad destination sewage that is not being collected, treated. So the environment is suffering a lot from this lack of basic sanitation. So when we talk to big financial investors, they each time are more looking for this type of projects that can even count in the future for financing on green bonds, since they are effectively green opportunity investment projects. So we believe that's one important issue to attract them. Another issue is the fact that the portfolio is so big. To attract foreign investors to Brazil, and mainly those big financial funds, we realize that they don't come for small projects most times. They want to have a big portfolio of opportunities, even to consider participating. And as in Brazil, all contracts go through a bidding process, and for basic sanitation now also. Sometimes the investor doesn't want to come to Brazil if it's not already investing here, get a legal team, understand the market, and then participate in one bid, eventually won't be the winner of this bid, and then lost money and time studying a market just for one opportunity. So one thing we mentioned is that in Brazil, most of our opportunities, they come again and again. So for example, in transportations, we had already many highways offer and many highways to go. Same thing for airports and other sectors such as energy. So investors that are looking at Brazil, they are understanding that we have already concrete opportunities for this year, but we also have concrete opportunities for next year and the next and years to come, since the challenge for universalizing the services in basic sanitation in Brazil is so big. So it's also a very big opportunity. So a lot has been said here, and many important things regarding the risk matrix, the risk allocation in the contracts, regarding the importance of legal certainty. And one important thing to say also is that, and that's an important role of PPI, since we've been working with PPPs and opportunities in so many sectors, we are always trying to bring the best practices from one sector to the other as they can be fitted in the specificities of this sector. So for the demand allocation, for example, we already have many sectors in Brazil with this risk allocation within the private investor, but that doesn't mean government is not responsible for understanding when things are not able to be predicted and even can be considered force majeure, as it's happening right now in Brazil because of coronavirus. So Brazil is sitting, the government is sitting with those investors and renegotiating those contracts, understanding that each sector has been affected, some sectors more, such as airports, some sectors less, some sectors even grew during the crisis, such as Brazilian ports. We are growing a lot during the crisis, other sectors less. So for those things that happen and that couldn't be predicted by anyone, and it's not the responsibility of the investor, and the investor might be losing money because of that, then of course we can rebalance the contract. So one thing that Daniela said that is very important is if we have good and strong contracts with regulation within the contract, making sure which are the rights and obligation of those investors, then for 30 years, you'll have this contract respected in Brazil, because as also has been said here, we have a strong track of legal certainty, respecting contracts. Even when we go through some political issues in Brazil, it doesn't affect long time contracts because they are always respected.
Thank you very much, Marta. You touched interesting points. Good to know that you have received, you are receiving a lot of interest from investors in general, including foreign investors for the water and sewage business. In my experience, I as a lawyer, have also been receiving a lot of questions and interest from, as you mentioned, the pension funds, such as the Canadian pension funds, the Middle Eastern funds, private equity funds, and European investors, even Chinese investors also interested in this water and sanitation sector. To a certain extent, some large Japanese trading companies could also be interested in those investments. So I think there is a good level of interest all over the globe. They in general would have different interests and profiles, right? In general, what they have in common, as you mentioned, is that they look into large investments to justify all the effort of understanding the sector and preparing for a bid. And also it's very important for them to understand, to recognize that there is a program of a pipeline of opportunities ahead, so that they can make an investment in understanding the sector, preparing for a bid, and they can take advantage of that in a series of opportunities rather than one single opportunity. But I would also like to hear Dolly on that particular aspect of the international investment. And then just I would also pass to afterwards to Daniela and Rafael, and already ask them to respond one question that was raised here by the audience, and then to make their final comments, perhaps addressing those latest points of Marta, or any other aspects that you would want to highlight among those that we discussed today. The one question that I selected from the audience was whether, actually from Renato Kanetaka, whether it would be possible to have concessions that would combine both the water sewage business with the management, the waste management, which we haven't seen projects like that, but an issue for discussion here. But so I will start with Dolly on the perspective of the international investors. Dolly, please, if you want to address some final comments as well, and then we'll move to Daniela and to Rafael.
Thank you, Virgilio. And I'm afraid after my comments, I'm going to need to leave the webinar because we're running over. Unfortunately, I need to join another meeting. But I would just in closing say that, you know, everything I'm hearing is extraordinarily encouraging. I think when foreign investors look at a country, they do exactly what Marta described. They look for scale of opportunity. They look for a pipeline. They want to come. They're incredibly keen and motivated to make these investments. The ESG profile is readily apparent. These would be, I think, from the perspective of most foreign investors, absolutely fantastic investment opportunities. So I think that the framework that has been set up, the combination of the legal, you know, the incentivization of government on the one hand and the new law to aggregate systems and make them ready and suitable for scaled foreign investment, that preparatory work that has been done, the work with PPI to develop a pipeline, standardization of procedures to reduce the bidding cost. All of these are extremely important initiatives that have been implemented, and I think are laying the foundation for a very, very successful program in basic sanitation. And I would really congratulate folks in Brazil for these really measured and very strategic threshold steps. And now I think, as Daniela put very nicely, it's a case of, in the same way, optimizing the risk allocation and making sure that these projects are delivered on time, on budget, with the right quality of standards that are enforced against the folks who come and make the investments and make the commitments, but at the same time that those investments and commitments are respected mutually by the government counterparties to ensure the stability that those kinds of investors will expect. I think one of the beauties of attracting foreign pension funds and infrastructure funds is that they're motivated to invest long-term alongside government. The rate of return that they expect is not private equity rate of return. It is it should be a reasonable rate of return for the investment opportunity, but then a reasonable rate of return. In return for that, you get a reasonable allocation of risk. So what would be unfortunate, I think, is if the risk profile goes up, because that will then make these projects more expensive than they should be. So I am very excited for Brazil and the sanitation space, and I'm looking forward to future collaboration, and wish everybody tremendous success. So thank you very much for the opportunity to participate, and Virgilio and the team, I apologize that I'll need to leave the meeting.
Thank you very much, Dolly.
Pleasure. Thank you. Much appreciated.
And now wishing continued success to BRK, and thanking BRK for having brought such a positive benchmark of professionalism into the water and sanitation business as today the largest private company, and bringing also important foreign investment, setting the model to other investors in the sector. Daniela, would you like to comment any of the other points, or perhaps address your final comments on this presentation?
I would like to thank you again for the opportunity to have these discussions here. Very fruitful discussions. Thank you very much. As it became clear here, we need to sit down and still discuss a lot on risk allocation. That's why I mentioned, I think that's the next challenge we have. We spoke about the demand risk as being partially controlled and offset by the fact that you have control on the commercial side, meaning that you can charge and then charge clients and do all sorts of commercial initiatives to protect demand. But that's just a piece of that. Actually, demand is driven by many factors. This is just one piece. Demand can be driven by new investments in the town, slow down of investments in the town when it goes down. And this is why I think that, as Marta said, the agreements does provide for discussions on force majeure events as a protection in situations that are not predictable. But again, the discussion on these discussions are subjective. You don't have parameters many times. There are a pandemic like this one, everybody would tend to say it's a force majeure event. But that's not the case in a situation that demand is shifted from one place to the other. For instance, when a city is growing steadily for years, and then for some reason another city that has more industries or things like that, the demand is transferred because people actually transfer their houses to this other city. So I think that once you understand that every 1%, 2%, 10% that has a shift in demand totally destroys a model for investment, it's very sensitive. The demand risk is very sensitive. You have to set standards for the discussion as to what sort of shift would not be reasonable risk to be bared by the investor. So I think that on that one, we still need to continue discussing and evolving because it might be that we are able to set standards of what would be a reasonable risk allocation and what would be close to the concept of force majeure, and then should not be shifted to the investor. I thank you very much for the opportunity here. Very good discussion, Marta, very good discussion. Dolly left already, Virgilio and Rafael as well. Thank you very much. We're all anxious to have these discussions and with this regulatory framework now. Lots of interest, investors, questions, very interesting moment. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Daniela. So I will turn to Rafael Vanzella, if you can address that other question of the audience and then make your closure remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Virgilio. I'll try to answer to the question raised by Renato Kanitaka concerning to the encompassing of all the basic sanitation segments or sectors, so water, sewage, and waste management, right? Well, I think Brazil in 2007, by enacting our national law on basic sanitation, has adopted a very comprehensive definition of basic sanitation, by which all these activities are really comprised, right? So basic sanitation in Brazil is water, sewage, waste management, and also drainage. So we have a very large and comprehensive definition of basic sanitation. We have already in the past two different trends to encompassing all such activities under the very same agreement or one same concession. The first trend was started by the waste management companies, very specialized on waste management companies, which modeled a more comprehensive concession, bringing the water and sewage towards to facilitate the charging of fees and the collection of tariffs and so on. As you may know, it's very difficult to charge for waste management services in Brazil. It's very easy to charge for water and sewage, but not the waste management. Normally, it's the public administration who pays directly for the contractor. And so the companies in this sector try to make a more comprehensive agreement to facilitate the charging, the collection of tariffs, the enforceability before the final users. This trend reached no success because such companies understood in the past that the activities were so different for operational investment reasons. So the basic conditions of rendering services were quite different. It was impossible to have economy or scale gains on it, and this trend has not progressed in a manner they imagined in the past. Nowadays, we have Caixa Econômica Federal, as Marta said, Caixa, such as BNDES, our development bank, are acting as project structuring companies in basic sanitation. And Caixa is trying to model very comprehensive agreements in the sense of comprising water, sewage, and also waste management under one and only single agreement. Once again, this is possible. We have been following the progress Caixa is making in some municipalities, but the market sounding of these projects is facing some difficulties or obstacles because once again, it's been difficult to find bidders interested in this business, all together comprised. But only one more information on that. We are now seeing state-owned companies such as SABESP, very specialized in water and sewage, entering in this new sector, which is waste management. Which might represent a new trend, although it's very in the beginning of this process. It's worth mentioning that SABESP has entered into 7 or 8 different agreements for waste management in recent weeks. So it's a very new information and very important one to be considered by all of us. I hope these my address your concern, Renato, and I thank you, Virgilio and Brazil Cham, for inviting me to be one of the panelists of this event. It was very productive and I learned a lot. Thank you.
Thank you, Rafael. And so I know we are extending our time here, so I'll turn finally to Marta and ask her final remarks and already take the benefit of appreciating the participation of all panel members. This was a very rich discussion. I'm sure we'll have to follow up with the topics we have raised here today.
Thank you very much. I'll make it quick so that we can all have lunch. Congratulations to all for your presentations. It was very interesting. Answering the question on whether it's possible to have a concession with water, waste, and even sewage all together. Yes, it's possible. We have already a pilot project on that. It's in the city of São Simão in the state of Goiás. We are structuring this concession of water, sewage, and solid waste all together. If this project goes forward, then we'll have this pilot so that other projects can happen also. I saw there was a Q&A asking about how is it possible to make municipalities work together if it's a responsibility of the municipality for solid waste, for example. So it already happens in Brazil because we have those metropolitan regions and consortiums of cities We're structuring, for example, two important consortium of cities in the state of Minas Gerais, Convale, and in the state of Ceará, another important consortium, where the cities will have only one concession, one contract signed with the investor to collect the waste, transport, and have all the services provided with the tariffs being paid by the consumers. So yes, it's a possibility, and we are already working on that. And for the question regarding investors interested, I forgot to mention also that we are watching an interesting move from energy investors interested in basic sanitation. We saw some investors in Brazil in some specific states buying some public companies through privatization models for energy provision. And they say there are many synergies from the energy services and the basic sanitation services, including the possibility of making only one bill for the whole thing. So that's an interesting thing we've been watching and talking to some investors also. I believe that now that the doors of this market are open for private investors, we will find different interested parties for different reasons, going from different sectors towards the basic sanitation sector. And we are very motivated to see all those contracts happen in Brazil. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Marta. So I think we come to the end of the event. I'll let John say the final words. I think we'll be able to share the materials we presented here today. And thank you very much for the audience. John.
Thank you, Virgilio. Thank you, Marta, Daniela, and all the panelists for an excellent discussion. And once again, special thanks to Machado Meyer for sponsorship and organization of this great panel. Yes, we will put out a link on the website to the recording and the presentation by Secretary Marta. Before I close, I wanted to remind attendees that on Thursday, August 6th, we will host a webinar on restructuring distressed companies in Brazil at 10 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, 11 a.m. Brasilia time. We hope to see you then. In the meantime, stay healthy and safe. Thank you again.